You're listening to ShipFam. On today's episode, Luke and I discuss the Dart and Flutter package ecosystem, as well as the seeming lack of Flutter top-down vision. Please review us wherever you get your podcasts and follow us on Twitter at CaseyC. and at Luke_Paghetti.
Hey Casey, so I don't know if you've noticed, but I released a package for Flutter a couple days ago. It's called Hotspot. It's got kind of a funny name. The name was actually inherited by the designer who came up with the design. Have you seen this at all recently? I posted on Twitter.
I didn't realize it was brand new. That's pretty impressive. It's kind of blowing up for a brand new package.
Yeah, it's only got it's only been out a couple days. The short version is it's for coach marks and tours. So the idea is that, in onboarding, when you get into your first home screen, then it pops up these little dialogues that point out certain features. And then when you click on next, the dialogue moves and points at the next feature, and it kind of goes through. But actually, the history on this package is kind of interesting because I wrote it, I think 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago. And the short version is I was working for this company, not going to say the name, and the designer wanted this feature. And I went to look on Pub, and pretty much everything at that point was just not very good, or, honestly, a lot of them just didn't even exist yet. So there wasn't really a good package out there for this use case. And he always referred to the package he always referred to the pattern as Hotspot. But I think that might have been a bit of a translation issue, because I found out later that nobody calls this thing Hotspot at all. It's just some random name. But in the true form of naming packages, random names is totally fine. So I just kept the random name. But what ended up happening is, a couple months ago, I found out that the company that I'd worked for actually declared bankruptcy. It was a startup. And so I had never published it as a package previous to that, because it wasn't really entirely clear to me, if I was allowed to post it or not. But I just didn't really want to. I didn't want to ask anybody about it, and I didn't really want to find out. And so I had it on GitHub in a public repo, but I had not actually published it to Pub. So it was available for people to look at, but nobody was consuming it. So then when I found out they declared bankruptcy, I was like, oh, okay, well, I guess I can just ship this thing now. So I pulled it down and just fixed up a couple little API issues, slapped a README on it, and posted it. And what's interesting is people seem to be really into it.
Yeah, I'm impressed. I haven't gotten much traction on any of my packages but one. Are you getting a sense of what drives package traction or not from having this one move pretty fast?
Well, what's interesting is I have one other. So Hotspot is unique compared to the other coach mark and tutorial packages because it's so simple and it's so opinionated. So you pretty much can just 2 minutes, you can add a really nice looking tour to any app, but it's kind of you get what you get, right? It's you can have any colored Ford Model T as long as it's black, right? But I mean, even that's not entirely true, because you can technically swap out the widget for whatever you want. But for the sake of this conversation, we'll just say that the API is insanely simple.
Yeah, dead simple, but gives you an escape hatch if you want to do it all yourself.
Yeah, exactly. That's what it is. Highly opinionated with an escape hatch. So, which I think is the best packages are like that, in my opinion. But this is actually not the first time I've had success with something like this. I have this other one called Solomon Bottom Bar. And every time I look at it, it's got more likes. It's now up to 945 likes. And it's literally a single, I think it's an 80 line of code single file. And that one's super interesting because it's basically this is yet another bottom navigation bar, but it has 3 promises. And this is something that I like to do when I can, because most packages don't make any promises at all. They're literally just here's this thing, use it or not. And the promises on this one is, we'll meet the specifications provided by the designer of this particular pattern. It's something that was posted on Dribbble once upon a time. And then the second promise is we will be accessible. And the third promise is the API will be identical to the Flutter bottom navigation bar. So you can literally just swap it out for all intents and purposes, and it works exactly the same.
Yeah.
And that thing's blown up. I think it's blown up because it's nice and it does exactly what it's supposed to do, and there's no gotchas, right?
Yep. Yeah, I found my most successful package too on PubDev is Flutter Gutter, which is a similar kind of thing. It's like dead simple. There's the gap package, which people may know, where it's you have a column or a row or a scrollable or whatever the heck it is, and you want to put a space between two elements. It's a pain to use sized box because you have to keep the axis of the scrollable or the column, etc., aligned with the sized box, and then you have to specify height or width depending on which it is, blah, 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 etc. And gap just automatically detects the axis it's inside of, so you don't have to specify height or width, you just specify a single size. I took that one step further because the part that drove me nuts is I would have this like messy constants file full of all these different gap sizes. I had like kpad, and it'd be like kpad times a bunch of math in a bunch of different places. I found it was way too easy to end up with a really inconsistent looking app because I was using different widths in different places, and then those didn't play nicely together. Because if you got something that's like 65% gap in one spot and then 100% in another, that's just going to look like crap. So this one just moved to the material breakpoint system, which is managed by Google, and just defines standardized gap sizes. And then I do like power of 2 multiples of that. And so now, unlike gap where you have to specify the size, instead you just do gutter, gutter small, gutter tiny, etc. And that one does reasonably well. It's at like 51 likes, so nothing crazy, but I feel like it gets a decent bit of attention. Similar thing, like dead simple promise.
I just noticed that adaptive breakpoints, I've never seen this package. I noticed that you depend on it.
Yep.
It's actually discontinued.
Yeah, I gotta figure out what to do about that. It's an official Google package. It's like
I mean, this is just like the reason I bring it up is not because I'm worried about you and what you're doing, but because it's just like so on brand for this stuff to be abandonware. Yeah,
yeah. I mean, I'd love to dive into this a little. I think adaptive breakpoints is awesome, and I think it's criminal that's not rolled into Flutter itself. To dive a little deeper. It's like, okay, you've got a phone, you've got a tablet, and you've got, say, a giant desktop, and you want to run the same UI in all three. Let's say same software, because the UI is going to look a little different depending on the device. And one part of that is on smaller screens, you want to be making more aggressive usage of that real estate. So your padding is going to be a lot smaller, and your gaps between different elements is going to be smaller. Vice versa, on a large screen, you now have a lot more space to work with. You can just have larger gaps to just create some more aesthetic separation. So that's what adaptive breakpoints does. They just like made some value judgments about what the default DP gap is at different screen sizes. And it's awesome, and you can, of course, overwrite it with your own opinions, but I find like it's such a bike shedding thing that just like use the defaults and who cares. And they have all this stuff in material that's really opinionated, really exhausting, and you kind of feel like you have to fight it. Here's a part of material that I wish were in Flutter and isn't. I don't know if there's really somebody making those top level decisions at Flutter.
You know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of the material keylines. When I first saw keylines in material, I thought that was like really cool. And then I went to go try to find the API in Flutter, and it just like did not exist.
Remind me on material keylines. I don't know this one.
Keylines, if I recall correctly, it was for doing things like aligning the contents of an app bar with contents in like a scroll view that was below it.
Nice. Okay.
So it just had like a nice visual lineup, especially on like the left, or we'll call it like the leading gutter, for example. So things like icons. And
you could define like, this is my leading edge, and then everything would respond to that or something.
Yeah, and it like didn't really matter like how nested they were, like what safe area was being involved. There was some kind of magic going on, or there was something about it that felt magic, and I can't remember exactly what the details were.
Yeah, I mean, this is a bit of a rabbit hole, but that reminds me of something that drives me nuts, is when you have, say, an icon button, and then below it in a column text, and let's say they're both left aligned, your icon button is going to have different padding than your text because icon button itself contains its own self padding.
Yeah,
and that
exactly.
drives me insane.
It drives me bonkers.
Yeah, I want the like physical vector art of the icon to be properly aligned with the text below it. There's all these layers of like hidden built-in padding. And I wish there was some way to just have, my ideal solution would be something like padding where different elements know they can eat into padding space.
Yeah,
so
right. It's like I can't remember if it's margin or in CSS. I think it's margin in CSS where like two side-by-side margins collapse into one.
Yeah,
so something like that.
Exactly. Yeah. So if icon button says, "Hey, I need like 6 units of margin on the left," and then it's wrapped in 12 units of left padding, then that margin is allowed to overlap into that left padding space, and only visual elements are going to respect that padding.
Yeah, I used to have this extension that I called the stakeholder pleaser, which was, I called it dot nudge on widget. And it was literally just a wrapper around transform.translate.
I love it.
So you could do like dot nudge y -5, and it would just like move the thing up 5 pixels.
Yep. I love it. I mean, the only thing I'd be afraid of is when you're dealing with something like icon buttons, the material system has, I don't actually know. I mean, it has like visual density and stuff like that. So your nudge is going to be wrong on a different platform. I almost wish there were like a Flutter approved, it respects all the accessibility, blah, blah, blah stuff happening under the hood, where I could say dot nudge and then it would just magically understand it under the hood.
And this is why I'm kind of half empty on material, because you can solve a problem and it can cause so many downstream issues that are just so hard to understand beforehand. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Just to kind of step back a little, the broader problem I have with the Flutter ecosystem right now is it feels like we're in a car with no driver. I don't know. Is that just me? Like,
no, it's not you at all. It's totally a thing. I was thinking about this earlier because, you know, every time I go to build a new app, pretty much every app is some variation on a form.
Yeah.
And just dealing with forms in Flutter is so
it's horrible.
horrible.
It's
the worst. Bad. And people have like pointed out all these packages that are meant to solve this problem, but the problem still doesn't feel solved. Like, to me, what you need is you start with a data class, right? So like, you know, user profile, for example, like all the fields that a user can fill out. And then you should be able to just hook up like text inputs and switches like to that data model and have them mutate that data model. But it should be like very straightforward and like have validation and everything all built in. And there's always some point where you need like a massive adapter to go between for example, all of these value notifiers, like text editing controller, or you need an adapter to go between like a map from a form. There's like just so many pieces to this puzzle that just eats up so much time. And to my estimation, it's just not solved.
Yeah, no, it's painful. Text editing controller I always struggle with too, because I want like a declarative, bidirectional, here's the current source of truth for what the text is in this place. But at the same time, I don't really want to deal with all the extras of text editing controller. What I really want is basically a text editing controller that I could just bind to my own controller with its own text field. And there's just like bidirectional mapping between those two. You can do it manually, but anytime you're doing that kind of bidirectional mapping from one declarative piece of state to another, it just gets messy.
Yeah. And other things too, like just the repository pattern, you know, outside of Firestore and real-time database, which just kind of like magically do it for you, I have not found any good primitives to handle like a persistent offline first repository that syncs with the back end. I haven't found it anywhere yet. If you compare it to something like in the world of React, they have all of these different state management packages. I'll just use Legend State because I'm familiar with it. You know, Legend State is a very straightforward state management system, and you can literally drop in plugins. Like there's a Supabase plugin, and you drop in a Supabase plugin and you have full offline tables with syncing and rules, and it takes like 30 seconds to set up.
That's wild.
And it's like trying to do that in Flutter, like you could spend multiple weeks trying to wire something that robust up.
Yeah, I mean, to keep hammering back, like, who's at the wheel at Flutter now? I mean, maybe I don't pay enough attention. Maybe I just don't know, and there is somebody out there with some top-down vision on the team, and they're even communicating that outward, but I don't know where to find it.
So I've got into a couple of, let's call them warm conversations on Twitter about this, and best I can tell, the team is small, and they're just really busy, and they are not focusing on any kind of DevRel at all. So anything that looks like DevRel is just essentially non-existent at this point. And that's not to say that the framework is dead. It's not even to say that the framework is dying. It's just, that's just not where their focus is. But because that's not part of their focus, it's not really clear what their focus actually is because there's not a lot of messaging on it.
Yeah, what feels like their like action betrayed, their implied focus. I know they've done a lot on games recently. If you roll back like maybe a year, their focus was really on getting onto Impeller. And they're still kind of finalizing Impeller on different platforms. Maybe that's what they're doing, is just games and Impeller at the moment. Well,
so I need to spend a little more time on this topic, but somebody posted on Twitter recently that Skia had actually added some graphics backends that, as I understand, were the reason for Impeller to even be created in the first place. So now the question is, like, did we ever actually need to make Impeller? Like not clear to me right now. And unfortunately, I just haven't spent enough time on it to have like a strong opinion on it. But like, I remember when Impeller first came out, I remember thinking to myself, oh, this feels like the rewrite that's never a good idea. And unfortunately, I just have not spent enough time on it to really have a strong opinion on this, but it smelled like that. And then I saw that tweet and I was like, oh man, this is starting to really stink. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Oh, that's rough. On a slightly different note, but related, have you seen Kevmoo? That's Kevin Moore, but he goes by Kevmoo.
Oh, I love
Twitter.
Kevin. Kevin's the best.
Yeah, I like that dude. And he's working on a project that I'm pretty excited about for Flutter. He's trying to take a bunch of the like core semi-UI agnostic layers of Flutter and pull them out. Yeah, so like the biggest example for me is ValueNotifier. And I feel like
that's a big one.
I've complained about this 5 different times, and each 5 times you've had to remind me why. I'll see some package that has its own, like, roll your own ValueNotifier, roll your own Listenable.
Yeah.
They're almost the exact same APIs, but they've just written it themselves. And every time it drives me insane because I want to be able to plug that into the rest of the Listenable ecosystem in Flutter. And if you've just redefined it with your own API, I can't. And I'm always complaining about it. And you're like, dude, it's because you can't depend on Flutter from pure Dart, and these packages have pure Dart as a constraint. Stuff like
it's so annoying. It's so frustrating and so avoidable. I'm really glad that he's doing that. One of the things I've always wanted is Swift has this crazy language feature where you can do an extension on an external class, and then you can make it conform to an implementation. So you could be like, you could like take Qubit, for example, and you could make it conform to like Listenable.
So it's like a translation layer between the two APIs. Nice.
Yeah. So something like that would be really awesome. And I've wanted something like that in Dart for forever. But without that, you're absolutely right. You're just screwed. You can't really do anything.
Yeah, I mean, specifically on ValueNotifier and Listenable, my conspiracy theory is that this is actually a huge part of why the state management ecosystem is so balkanized in Flutter.
It's so scuffed.
I mean, the biggest reason it's scuffed is because Flutter didn't step up to the plate and provide us a full solution. I mean, we've got the building blocks to a great state management system in Flutter, but it's all too low level. But the secondary...
The closest version to that was Scoped Model, but that never really took off after Block became a thing.
I don't know Scope Model.
So Scope Model is essentially you build change notifiers and then you provide them down the tree. So it's basically change notifier plus original provider is like the closest version. Gotcha. And as I understand it, actually came from the Fuchsia code base. So back in the beginning, if you asked the internal Flutter team members what state management system they would use, I wouldn't say a majority, but I would say there was a clustering of them that were all using Scoped Model. And then when Block came out on the scene, it got like hyper popular, which never really made sense to me why it got so popular. I think it was because it was backed by VGV and people just wanted some sense of like architectural guidance from someone that they could trust. Scoped Model essentially died on the vine, a couple months later, like a year later, I would say.
Gotcha. Yeah, to dive in specifically on ValueNotifier, why I'm excited about that coming out of Flutter is right now, let's say you want to have a block as your controllers or your repositories, and you want to consume that elsewhere, and you don't want to use blocks built-ins. Or maybe you could imagine it a different way where it's like, okay, I want to have a RiverPod controller, but then I want to bind to that in my UI using something unrelated to RiverPod. Because each one of these are really separate concerns, and you could have different opinions at different places. And most importantly, if you want to migrate on or off of a state management package, it's much easier if you can do it one concern at a time. And right now, today, for example, RiverPod has its own built-in listenable system, and then it has its own built-in system for binding to a listenable and triggering updates.
And dependency injection, too.
Yeah, so each one of these different things has its own RiverPod-specific flavor. And I would love for them to all just use Listenable and a couple other standardized building blocks, but RiverPod wants to be able to work in pure Dart environments, so it can't. So I think there's actually a lot of potential for a Flutter independent value notifier that is exposed by the Google team and is the official one that Flutter uses internally to really get a lot of traction. And hopefully people like Remy will migrate their packages to use this instead of their own bespoke listenable system. And we can see a much, much more interoperable state management environment. And what I really hope is we'll start seeing smaller state management packages that are a lot more laser focused and give you a lot more ability to mix and match as you need.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that getting the listenables out into Dart is going to be a pretty big unlock. It's not really clear to me how big an unlock, but it seems like it's going to be an unlock for sure. And then the next thing I would love to see, and this one is rarely talked about, but when it comes to all these JSON serialization packages, because now we have JSON serializable, that's kind of the OG. Yep. Oh, and then built value and built collection and freezed and Dart mappable. Yep. And there's like others too. I mean, I think there's maybe 10 of them at this point.
Yeah, Dart mappable is my favorite, by the way. For
that's the one. Dart mappable is the one that I'm using right now. But what's interesting to me is none of these conform to the same protocol. And there's actually an interface provided by Dart called codec. And so what you could have is you could have a JSON codec and it could do something like string in and dynamic out, which obviously is not great, but it like kind of gets you there. And what you could do is all these packages could have members that export, instead of like a to JSON from JSON, it could export a codec that has that same interface. And then all of these individual data class serialization packages could then interop with things like persistence libraries, right? And so all of these things are completely broken apart into tiny little pieces. And then if you compare to a language like Swift, they have the Codable protocol, which essentially is the Swift version of that codec interface that I'm talking about. But the thing that's unique about Swift is that their protocols are able to constrain on the class level, like a static member, and also on the instance level, like an instance member. So for example, right now we have to.json is on the instance, and then from JSON is a static factory on the class, right? So in Dart, you can't actually create an interface that has both of those. You can only create an interface that has the to.json.
Yep.
So you can handle like serializing to string, but you can't handle going from string to like a factory creating the class. And so that's why you end up having these external mapper classes. Like I think Dart Mappable has them, built value has them, but then stuff like freezed does not have them. JSON serializable does not have them. But if all of these generated these codecs or something similar, then you'd have full interop between all these things. That would be really, really, really nice.
Yeah, I'm not sure I fully caught how the codec works. Can you give me like an example?
Codec is literally just a class that has essentially like an encode and a decode method. So colloquially, that would be like a to JSON and a from JSON. Yeah. But because it's its own class separate, you can actually ensure through generics that they have both the encode and the decode. Whereas on these data classes, you can ensure that they have to JSON, but you can't ensure that it has from JSON, because from JSON is like a static method or a static factory.
Yeah.
And Dart interfaces don't have the ability to constrain those.
Yeah, so we imagine like Firestore could have a .write that takes in like t extends codec.
Yeah, exactly. T extends codec of, string comma dynamic or something.
Yeah,
like that.
and then internally it can figure out how to turn that into whatever serialization thing it wants to write to Firestore.
Yeah,
itself.
exactly. Because all these serialization packages would export these individual codecs.
Yeah,
for
I like
each of
it.
the class that you make. So yeah, but anyway, the implementation, that's just like the closest vanilla implementation I can think of. But the larger concern is we don't have any kind of consistency around serialized classes in Dart. Whereas if you look at a language like Swift, they do. And it makes things so much easier in Swift. So in Swift, they can have like a shared preferences box and the type is codable. So you can take any data class and you can dump it into this box and you don't have to set up to JSON from JSON methods or any of this stuff.
That's sweet. Yep.
And so like being able to like delete that, it sounds minor, but it's actually like a pretty big difference in terms of developer experience.
Yeah.
And it just provides a unifying API around this concept of serialization.
I don't get why so few languages consider deserialization and serialization as a first-class language requirement.
Yeah, and Swift absolutely does, which is amazing.
Yeah, I mean, to explain to the audience why this matters, you might say, man, there's packages, you can figure it out, it's not a big deal. Anytime you're moving away from the default, there's like huge fall off and fragmentation for the developer community. And the best way I can illustrate this is, sure, we have all these different Dart mappable, freezed, etc., different solutions for serialization, deserialization in Dart. But if you go on the Flutter Discord at any given time and you go into the general help channel, about 30% of the questions where people are asking for Flutter help are, hey, here's 200 lines of like the most hideous manual JSON parsing you've ever seen in your life. I'm getting a null pointer error. I don't know what that means. Please fix my code for me. So you can have all these great solutions, and the noob is always going to end up writing, in the absence of a default built-in, will always end up writing manual JSON parsing with like 10 layers of horrifying nesting, and then is going to hit a brick wall because it's going to break in 10 different ways. And you could say, okay, cool, but they're noobs. Of course they're going to have trouble. But you really want the happy path to be as close to the correct path as possible, because otherwise you're just wasting people's time.
And there's always some kind of foot gun. It's like, okay, let's say you go with freezed. Now all of a sudden, for example, it's really hard to make, any class serializable, right? And then you go to Dart mappable and like now any class feels serializable. Like it feels a lot more first class, but, code generation packages will usually have a flag that allow you to use freezed or something else, right? So because freeze is so popular, it's like kind of expected, you know what I mean? So there's all these little tensions at play when you're trying to make these selections. And so being able to have that all handled is really nice.
Yeah, the counterpoint I've gotten when I make this argument is, well, I really want choice. Why do you not want choice? And I think that's the wrong way to put it. I want choice plus a robust, sane default. And 99% of the time, me personally, I'm going to take that robust, sane default. But that 1% of the time can matter a lot. So I still want that choice and I want that escape hatch. Like you were saying earlier, you want simple and opinionated with an escape hatch. And that's what I'd love to see from Flutter and Dart in a lot more places.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting tension here because when I see that we have 10 plus, data class libraries, data class packages, to me, that just proves that we need a sane default, right?
Yep. Yeah, and that's the other argument I've heard is like, well, if we have a sane default, a lot of those choices are going to lose popularity and they're going to dry up and I'm going to miss all that choice. But that's kind of just like capitalism, man. if capitalism, new solution outcompetes and you lose some other options because the new solution outcompetes, like, come on, cry me a river, the new solution was better. That's why the other versions died. So why are we crying about this? I think you see a lot of that logic in the web community and the React Native community by extension, where there's just this massive stack of layers on top of layers on top of layers on top of layers, and each layer is a really complicated multifactorial decision. Like even at the most simplest level, what language stack am I going to use for my React Native project?
Right.
It's like JSX or JSHTML CSS or like TSX. It just is this huge combinatorics of decisions. And they say how much they love that choice. I see that choice, I'm like, oh my God, please stop wasting my time. I don't want to think about this.
Yeah, you would love Vue, Solid, or Svelte. Pretty much anything but React is what you would love.
Yeah. And I mean, there's cool stuff in the React world, but it's just like, I am more interested in just getting the job done. And I think when you get that many different choices, even if some of the choices are amazing at getting the job done becomes that much harder because you had to make all those choices along the way. And I think there's a lot of shiny things syndrome that engineers fall for, especially in React world.
Yeah, that's like, I was just spinning up a new project recently and I wanted to take a look at on-device databases. And I did a quick look through on Pub, and essentially my request I felt was pretty straightforward, which was I want something that uses SQLite. I wanted to create queries that are backed by streams so that I can just like get reactive, queries. And I want it to have auto migration for like creating and renaming columns. Those are the three things that I wanted. And I found out that there are no packages on Pub that have any kind of auto migration for SQL. And that just like completely blew my mind because this is just standard in pretty much every other popular language. And it's interesting because when I say auto migration, people get like really bent out of shape because there's a lot of reasons to not like it. But what I'm saying is I should be able to delete a column, rename a column, or create a column and not have to write a migration for that. And that experience is like very standard outside of Dart.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, there are some pretty hard problems in there, but yeah, of course, your specific operations are the few simple cases in a sea of brutal edge cases.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I don't know what to say for the Dart and Flutter ecosystem. It just keeps coming back to sounding like a broken record here. It feels like there's no driver here.
Yeah, no, I agree. That said, I'm still building apps with it. At this point, I don't know how long that's going to last, but it's my best option. I think if I was going to look for an alternative, I'd probably be looking at Expo. But even then, that's got all kinds of footguns associated with it. What I really want is I just want a better Flutter experience. And I don't feel like it's that far away.
No.
Also, I've been saying that for 4 years now. So.
Yeah, I mean, it keeps coming back to, I think, lack of top-down vision. It's stuff like you're complaining about Form earlier. There's a lot of specific problems with Form, but one of them is just that it uses like a global key pattern that is used almost nowhere else in Flutter.
Almost, yeah, right.
Yeah, and it's like, okay, so some engineer somewhere had to solve this problem that 10 other engineers have to solve, and for whatever reason, this one person solved it in a completely different fashion. And now, forever, this part of the API is just randomly using a different pattern than every other part.
Yeah, like, why isn't there just like a form controller? Like, why is it using a global key?
Yeah, there's a couple other places in Flutter where it's not global keys, but they use non-controller patterns. Trying to think of one off the top of my head, it's not quite coming to me. But my suspicion, and this is entirely me just assuming from looking at the APIs and doing like API archaeology, is early on, there's a need to control something from outside of the UI layer. And there are a bunch of different ways to solve that. A lot of them are sane. And nobody had the leadership tech lead position to just say, this is the opinionated way that Flutter does this. Nobody wrote that memo internally. So a bunch of different like sub tech leads or even individual engineers, or hey, even maybe the intern at some point was like, okay, here's this problem. I'm going to invent a wheel to solve this problem. And then especially frustratingly, the controller pattern clearly emerged as the winner and the standard process, but nobody went back and cleaned that up and migrated everything.
But it's funny because even the controller pattern isn't ideal, because if you want to say, for example, have like a view model that contains all these controllers, there's no way in Flutter to have that view model subscribe to all those controllers easily. You end up having to create a subclass. Like I have one that's called like listening change notifier. And the fact that that's not first class is just wild to me.
Yeah, I mean, you basically need a hook. And broadly, I don't like hooks that much. I think they can kind of compound into a sea of foot guns. But I think there are some specific case, highly generalizable hooks that get you 90% of the way there. Like .of context is basically a hook. Like it's a hook, and everybody's happy with that. Nobody complains about that. So I'd love to see a little bit more. The one I really, really want to see, and I have a GitHub issue that I'll put in the show notes for this, is a depend on listenable hook. So right now, if I want to bind my Flutter widget to some sort of listenable, that listenable has to be held in the widget tree via an inherited widget. And that just seems like such a frustrating arbitrary constraint where my consumer of state becomes hyper opinionated about where the state is held. And there's a specific reason the Flutter team did this. They pushed back on my GitHub issue with this reason. And that's if you merge holding of state and binding of state, you force the consumer of that state object to get a listenable reference to it. There's no accidental way to reference an inherited widget without also listening to the inherited widget. And I think there's some truth to that, but I still like depend on listenable because right now the alternative is listenable builder. And for example, if you wanted to write your custom class you're talking about with a chain of listenable builders, it's only like 2 listenable builders deep that becomes an unreadable nightmare.
Yeah. And then you end up with things like Context Watch, which is like maybe the most based package to exist in the last year, I think.
Yeah. Earlier, you were talking about Flutter alternatives and what you would go for. I know there's Kotlin multi-platform and then Jetpack Compose, which are almost creating a world where native Android dev can double as a Flutter style canvas render.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. The thing is, though, is it's a little early. So as I understand it, people, latched onto our tweets about that and decided to try it out. And they were having these issues like 15-minute build times on like a Compose multi-platform Hello World project and stuff like that. So I think what I would say about that at this point is it looks like there's something on the horizon here, but it's not clear if they're going to pull it off or not. But if they do pull off like the baseline developer experience, I think it's going to be like a pretty serious platform.
Yeah, and I love Flutter, but to be honest, if you give me that pitch and you snap your fingers and it magically works and it's magically as mature as Flutter, I think it would be hard to argue in favor of keeping Flutter around or using Flutter over it, because being non-native on a platform comes with downsides. I think people tend to exaggerate those downsides, but there's undeniably some frustrations and downsides to being non-native on a given platform. So if you can be cross-platform on 5 different platforms and then native on one, that's just strictly better than being non-native cross-platform on 6. So why wouldn't you go for it? And the biggest advantage, too, is like one problem with Flutter is the hiring market sucks. And that's partly because really you have to be a Flutter engineer, and Flutter has to like chicken and egg the there's no jobs, there's no candidates, there's no jobs problem that we're seeing right now. And if you can just piggyback on the existing Android native dev job market, that completely bypasses that chicken and egg problem. And from day one, you have a robust, healthy candidate and job market.
Yep.
But there's one more place I want to go with that. The thing I would love to see is one of the biggest problems with Flutter adoption in the US, from what I've seen, is founders, some I've talked to, even interviewed with and pitched Flutter to them, say that Flutter doesn't feel native on iOS. And they're really worried that users will dislike the app because of that. And I don't know how true that is, but it's at the very least a sticking point for founders, and it may also be a sticking point for user engagement and adoption. So I want to see is a canvas renderer that takes an iOS Swift UI project and then runs it in a canvas renderer on other platforms. So native on Swift, cross-platform everywhere else. I think that would be absolutely killer.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, Tim used to run the show of Flutter, and then he left and is now at Apple on SwiftUI. And it's so funny to me because he was famous for pushing Flutter to so many platforms. And when he left for SwiftUI, my first question was, is SwiftUI going to push for going to so many platforms? But it does not align with Apple's ethos on software at all. So it's hard for me to like imagine a world where that's the case.
Yeah, Apple's position to, I want SwiftUI to run on other platforms is, what other platforms?
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Yep. Their whole goal is to be so dominant that they squeeze out every single other platform, and supporting cross-platform just undermines their own position in that respect.
Yep.
Yeah.
No, I agree.
Shall we call it on that pessimistic note?
Yeah, let's call it a pessimistic note. I will leave a little teaser for the next episode because I feel pretty confident about what we're going to talk about. You had mentioned basically that's capitalism, bro. And one of the things I want to talk about in our next episode is all of the insane like peak capitalism patterns that you see on the App Store that are just kind of normal and normalized, things like dumping and bundling and stuff like that, that is largely seen as being antitrust within the context of the United States, but is like very common on the App Store platform. So we can talk about that next time.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to it. I'll have to keep my inner commie in check for those conversations.
All right. No, actually, we need your inner commie for that one. So
sounds great.
All right, man.
Talk to you later.
Talk soon.
Editor's note from Casey here. We mentioned a bunch of cool Flutter packages, as well as Kevmoo's initiative to pull ValueNotifier out of the Flutter SDK. Please check the show notes to see links to all the relevant GitHub issues and pub dev packages. Thanks for listening.